Right before we get going, we're going to try to do two things a little bit different here today. The first is we really want to open this up to everybody. So we're going to do a couple of things. One is we've got Steve Miller over here. He's mic'd up for us. He'll be asking some questions of me. We're going to have kind of a conversation. I've worked with Steve Miller, a.k.a. Smiller, a.k.a. Smurder, for about a decade now, and he knows as much about this business as anyone. So he's going to kind of keep me honest, keep us going in the right direction. And if you guys have comments that you want in the middle of the presentation, you have questions, please find Steve. We want to know that as we go along. So we're excited to kind of hear what you think on this topic. We also have Chris Glyer live tweeting. So Chris, if you get anything from the Twitter sphere you want us to bring up here in the presentation, find Steve Miller. We'll try to get that right here in the presentation. So that's the first thing we're doing different. The second thing is this actual topic is something we don't traditionally do as a company. We talk about an intrusion, a threat group, a particular campaign. We typically have not revealed the guts of this operation. Let's talk about all the campaigns, all the intrusions. Let's talk about what this stuff means in totality. So we're going to kind of open the hood here at FireEye and show you some of those numbers, talk about what we think is important, and really kind of end it with some recommendations. So again, if you have questions, comments as we go along, please find Steve. Steve's going to interject as we go through. So we're going to get this thing going. So let's kind of start with what I do here at FireEye. I sit on the advanced practices team, as does Steve Miller. We do three things for this company. The first, we make analytical decisions on what an adversary is. What's a threat versus an adversary? What do we need our best experts to go after? We identify that. Job two, we pursue those adversaries wherever they are across FireEye. Doesn't matter if it's product, Mandiant, managed defense, our focus is on those adversaries. Period, hard stop. The third thing, we take everything we learn and we make it actionable for the entire company. So you hear Kevin this morning talking about frontline expertise, applying it to products. That actual work is what we do in advanced practices. So we're going to focus on that as our worldview for this presentation. So we're going to touch on three things. We love data. We're very data greedy. Data keeps us honest. So we're actually going to kind of show you the realities of our data here at FireEye. We're going to then talk about some of the key trends that we see in that data, what we think it means for our clients and our industry, and then I want to end with some recommendations. We'll kind of give three recommendations at the very tail end of this presentation. So let's kind of start with what is the reality of data. Let's get away from marketing, let's get away from buzzwords, let's talk some hard numbers. We're going to focus on hard numbers and ground truth for this entire presentation. The first thing is, really fundamentally, we have three kinds of data at FireEye. Please don't view this as an organization chart, a business unit line. This is how we on our team look at the entire company and how we get data in. The first, the green side, is our appliance telemetry. From a pure volume standpoint, this is about 2/3 of our total data set at FireEye comes purely from our products. We love telemetry data because it gives us two things. The first, it gives us scope and scale. Do you want to know, is this rare? Is this common? Is this only an APJ? Is it global? Telemetry data is excellent for that. The other thing it's really good at is pre and initial compromise. If you look at our attack life cycle, the first part of that, the telemetry data, is the best way to get after that. It's the best way to understand what are the initial intrusion attempts, what's working, and what's not. Again, about 2/3 of our total data set. The next part you'll see in red, this is our engagement data. This represents about 1/3 of our total volume. This is what we see from Mandiant and managed defense. When we get hired to do these breaches, we go through these intrusion events, this is what we view as engagement data. We really love engagement data for three reasons. The first, it gives us event depth. If you think you can really understand an intrusion only from telemetry, you're going to miss whole swaths of the intrusion. That event depth at a single client gives us knowledge that we just can't get anywhere else. The second thing is, it gives us timelines. A lot of times people think an intrusion happens, it's one event, and then it's over. These things go on, and we'll actually show you some numbers. These go on for weeks, months, years. Your telemetry data will not show you that. It won't show you what a group does over an 18-month intrusion. Your incident response data will. And the last is it gives us post-compromise. Telemetry data is not great at the back half of the intrusion life cycle. The engagement data is. And the third part is our intelligence data. This is forums that we have our intelligence teams doing dark web monitoring. This is third-party integration. We'll give a shout out. If you want to know about how we use third-party data, Aaron Stevens, AKA 4Steve. Where's 4Steve at? He's going to give a talk on how we use some of this data later on today. It's excellent. How we actually use another vendor's data to secure our clients, and then also some of that open source intelligence that we do as well. So this is the way we view data here at this company.
Organic data versus data we get from somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, when his mic came on, how much of this data is organic data, meaning it comes from our clients, our appliances. Every single piece of data I'm going to talk about today is organic data. We're not going to provide you a single piece of data that didn't come from our appliances and our clients. So this is kind of the box that we in advanced practices run across. The blue numbers are kind of the general totality on any given day. The gray numbers are what we see in any given moment, and it gets us in a 24-hour period. So we have access to about 18 million endpoints. Let's dive deep on this one for a second. This is not we see 18 million endpoints. We probably see about 3 times that many endpoints. These are how many endpoints we can actually reach in and interact with. We can run triage. We can pull LR. We can do all these different activities physically interacting with the endpoint. Some perspective, we had the NSA director here this morning. The DoD has about 9 million endpoints. So we as FireEye can directly interact with twice as many endpoints as the DoD has in their entire inventory. Mailboxes, pretty easy. This number here, third-party events, we see about 8.2 trillion events from other vendors. This is Cisco firewall logs, name it. This is anything not FireEye. We have the ability via Helix to ingest this and understand that. And then we've got 7,700-ish customers in about 60-plus countries. It's been really interesting to see that number grow over time. Mandiant just did our first incident response event in China. If you'd have told me that post-APT1 report, I never would have believed you. But that's a neat thing to see the world change. The bottom numbers, this is what we kind of deal with in 24 hours. I kind of show these, not so much as like, hey, these are great numbers, but this is a different skill set. You cannot look at 10 petabytes of flow data every single day. It's physically impossible. We have to build systems and analytics to do this for us, and then pull out what we think is most important out of that, in this case, 10 petabytes. You heard Kevin Mandia mention we see 1.1 million malware samples a day. We'll talk about that number throughout the day in this presentation as well. So this is kind of how big our box is for organic data on any given day. Let's talk about data SKUs. We would not be honest brokers if we presented our data as perfect. Our data is not. We tend towards some things, and we tend away from other things. The first is we tend towards Fortune 1000 companies. Everybody in this room kind of knows about Mandiant and FireEye. We're not cheap. We're a fairly expensive vendor. That's not an industry secret. Mom and pop trucking company are not typically our client set. So our data skews towards those Fortune 1000 companies. We also skew towards North America and the EU. We have APJ clients. We have larger EMEA clients. But the majority of our data set comes from Western Europe, the US, and then we're growing into the rest of the world. So again, I don't want to say we don't have visibility in those places, but we've done one IR in China. So our China data set's a little limited. We've never done an IR in Russia. Our Russia data set's a little limited. And the last part, we deal with events that are going on. We don't have calm clients. Nobody is going to pay FireEye to do an event response that they don't need. So our clients tend to trend towards events, active attackers, things of those natures. So there's a very real potential that our worldview does not map the actual worldview because we're only dealing with a subset. Very, very real possibility for us. So this is kind of our data SKU writ large. So let's get into it. So the first thing we always get asked is, what does a typical intrusion response client look like? I'd be lying if I told you they look the same. They all look different. Every one of them is different, but this is the means and the averages of our number. Let's start left of the line. One thing that we talk about all the time, 100% of our clients have security devices. Our clients tend to be pretty well secured. We often think about, as an industry, if there's a big bad breach, the clients didn't do the right thing. Usually not true. Our clients are compliant. Our clients spend money on cybersecurity. So we want to kind of level set that right off the bat. The days of showing up and doing an incident response and there's no firewalls, like that happened in 2003. This is 2019. Those are not our clients anymore. The second part is there's no such thing as a FireEye client. They just don't exist. Everybody has multiple vendors. So you have to learn to work with multiple vendors, otherwise you won't be successful in this space. Even us here at FireEye use other vendors. Not even FireEye is a standalone FireEye client. That's just the nature of the industry. The next two numbers, we get asked all the time about environments. Our cloud guys, I hope you're not in the room because they hate when I say this, but everyone's talking about cloud. You got to get to the cloud. About 1 out of 5 of the breaches we deal with are considered fully in the cloud. It's still the minority. I think this is a kind of a binary false conclusion. It's like you're either on-prem or off-prem. The reality is almost all of our clients are both. They're hybrid environments. It's very rare to have a fully off-prem or a fully on-prem client. That's just not the way the world works. And once we get hired to do an event response between Mandiant and Managed Defense, in about 40% of the cases, that client did not find that intrusion. Somebody else found it for them. Us, another vendor, the government, whatever the case may be. This number is trending higher over time. We talk about it in M-Trends all the time, but it's still, anywhere from, 1 out of 3 to 4 out of 10 clients missed the intrusion that we're there to deal with. So that's kind of the reality that we deal with. The right side of the slide, I put some asterisks here, because again, we're talking about typical client. Without getting into the FireEye product set, we don't sit at the boundary. You can't buy a FireEye router. You can't buy a FireEye firewall by and large. So we sit behind other security devices by and large. We get to then see what comes through those devices. And what we see on average at a typical client, they're seeing 500 malicious emails a day, every day, day after day after day, get through that security boundary. That's what we are seeing inside the security boundary. The other part is, once that phishing activity is found, so you do your VT run, it shows up, one of the AV vendors have it. If we start the clock at that point and give the entire industry 1 week to catch up, about 42% actually implement detections. So in the given case of a week, 58% of those malicious emails will still get through after being detected for a week by one vendor. That's kind of the reality of what these clients face. So let's flip this a little bit. What's a typical intrusion look like? Intrusions are like snowflakes. They're all different, just like every other one of them. So everything is different. Everything is the same. But the first thing I'll say is most of our clients deal with multiple attackers or a significant event. 49% of our clients, let's do the math easy. I'm not a math guy. Let's just say half. Half of our clients deal with significant attack confirmed and multiple attackers in their environment. So let's start with significant attack. For us to consider an intrusion a significant attack, you have to have 3 things. Not 1 of 3, not 2, have to have all 3. Compromised creds, lateral movement, and data theft. So we're telling ourselves that our clients see these 3 things from multiple attackers 49% of the time. That's what a typical client looks like.
Steve, can you go into the multiple attackers thing? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of times people tend to think we show up, we do a breach, and it's APT41, it's FIN7. And what we see a lot of, we actually see the majority of times, is this APT41 and FIN7. It's an Iranian threat group and a Chinese threat group. It's just start filling in the blanks. So the kind of mentality a lot of organizations have is you're going to deal with one threat. That's typically not the case. One of my favorite IRs of all time, we were hired to do an Iranian IR. We show up. Iran activity is active, it's going, and oh, by the way, so is APT3. You cannot remediate APT3 in Iran the same way. The APT3 is highly capable. If you put your eyes out, you'll lose them forever. You can put your eyes out with any Iranian group. You can respond. They can't deal with the remediation like APT3 can. So that's a pretty typical thing for us.
And multiple attackers, are those attackers usually in the same place, or are they in different places in the organizations that we're responding to?
It's kind of a mixed bag. It's hard to say one or the other. We've had numerous instances of multiple attackers on the exact same host, same environments. Sometimes it's different. Sometimes it's the same time frames. Sometimes it's not. You might have one attacker last year and a different attacker now, but you didn't know about last year until we show up. So it's kind of a mixed bag on the attackers piece. The last part I'll show is kind of this right-hand side of the slide. We talk about the timeline for a typical intrusion. We actually don't even really map it out because it's so difficult to measure. So we actually talk about dwell time. When did an attacker start, and when did somebody first find them? Forget solve, forget remediate. When did somebody know that attacker was active? Our 2018 numbers is 78 days. So your typical intrusion, your attacker went unnoticed for 2.5 months before anybody found them. That's that average. The other part we talk about is you tend to see these attackers come back. Half the instances, the exact same attacker comes back within 1 calendar year. If you take that out one step, say a same or similar attacker, so like one Iranian group or a different Iranian group, China, China, Fin, Fin, wherever that may be, you see 2 out of 3 are targeted by same or similar within 18 months. So a lot of times we have to really work with our clients and say, this isn't about solving this now. It's about, are you ready for the next year? Because they're coming back. That's what the hard numbers tell us about that. So that's what a standard intrusion looks like. Let's talk about all the intrusions. So between Mandiant and Managed Defense, we as a company last year responded to 858 breaches. This is not product clients that had an alert go off. This is not, we saw some bad stuff. This is, we provided a service to our clients in direct incident response and event work. We had 858 of these last year. Here's where things get really interesting.
Hold up, Steve. So those 858, you were saying required compromised credentials, lateral movement. So each of these incidents had all those things.
Most of these had all of those things. Some of these didn't.
Gotcha.
So what's interesting is we start teasing this number apart of what's actually inside of here. Let's start with the environment itself. We always get asked, tell me about Mac, tell me about Linux, tell me about Windows. So we'll talk about Mac-specific and Linux-specific intrusions. So let me level set this. When I say specific, we mean that compromise was targeting only that kind of machine. We had 1 Mac-specific event last year. We had 9 Linux-specific events last year. Here's what that doesn't mean. So let's do the 9 plus 1. We're at 848 remaining events. That 848 does not mean Microsoft only. What that typically means is mixed environments. Most intrusions deal with Windows compromises, Linux compromises, Mac compromises. It's that hybrid environment again. So there's kind of a market perception that a certain type of device gets targeted in a certain type of intrusion, and that just really isn't borne out by the numbers. We tend to see intrusions occur, multiple technology types, and the attackers go after that. So that's what the numbers kind of bear out there. If we shift gears a little bit, we get asked about pen test and red team. You heard Kevin Mandia talk about this today. We had, let's just say, 50 events to make the math easy. We had 48 instances where we were paid to come in and help a client respond to a pen test or a red team. So this number is going up and up and up. It wasn't that long ago in Managed Defense. We had the first time ever we dealt with a pen test at one of our clients, and now we see it pretty frequently. This number does not include internal client security tests. This doesn't include other aspects of just testing. This is a third-party company was paid to compromise a client, and we were paid to help respond to that, in some cases, our own red team. That's super fun, by the way, responding to your own red team. We had 12 confirmed insider events. What I mean by this is we had an intrusion or an extortion attempt, and we could confirm somebody involved in that organization was privy to the malicious activity. So again, about, let's do the math here, boop, 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 about 1.5% of all intrusions had an insider. So does it happen? Sure. Does it happen a lot? Definitely not. And we're going to come back to the insider piece here a little bit later on. My favorite number is the targeted attacks. This is kind of the wheelhouse that we live mostly in. Targeted attacks is that group targeted that client for something specific. So about 1 out of 4 intrusions that we responded to fell into this category, which is kind of interesting for us because we're kind of known for these. These are the things that we tend to talk about, and it's about 25% of our total event response.
Can you dig into that? What does it mean for a single client to be targeted? And how do we know?
So a good example would be we have APT 41, target an organization for a specific function or a specific person in some cases. You have Fin7 target a specific company because of a specific kind of data theft they want to do to monetize. What wouldn't count as targeted is we have a large financial threat that's just seeing what they can send out and 10 victims come back. They don't care which 10. They sent out 20 attempts and 10 worked. Those don't count in this number. So with all that being said, that kind of level sets our data. Let's kind of move into some of the key trends. These are the things that we see and we think are most important across the totality of our clients. The first is, let's just kind of talk about motivation so we can move past it. It wasn't that long ago, we sat in the government and we brainstormed about every potential hypothetical bad scenario. What's the cyber Pearl Harbor? When are we going to see these kinds of scenarios? The reality is now is we've kind of seen all of them. We saw almost all of them last year. So if you come up with a potential scenario, we can probably tell you, a client, we did an event response for that ad. We have nation states committing crime. We have criminals helping nation states. We have destructive attacks. We have accidental destructive attacks. We have attackers actually rebuilding boxes so they can compromise it easier. I mean, you name a scenario, and we've kind of seen it. This is my favorite kind of screenshot here. If you want to know if cyber's made it big, there's 3 things I love about this guy here. First of all, it's the local news. Like, this isn't like Reuters. This isn't, a industry specialist. This is the local Hawaii channel. And you got an AARP member, that's my second favorite part, talking about cybercrime affecting their individuals that they care about. If you want to know if cyber has finally landed as a topic, it's when this guy's talking about it on the news. Like, not wonks, not us. You got this guy talking to AARP members in Hawaii. The best example I can give you, I live in the cyber mecca of Belleville, Illinois. I live out in the cornfields, and I talk to my neighbors about 3 things. Did my dog get out and run away into his yard? He's got a huge raccoon problem. Did he catch any raccoons last night? And he asked me about these whole cyber criminals he's been hearing about. When my neighbor's asking me about cyber criminals, we've seen it all already. That's the best indicator I can give you. We kind of wait and say, if this thing happens, the industry's going to change. If that thing happens, the world's going to pivot. I think we've kind of crossed them all off the list. We've seen virtually all the scenarios play out in reality. So moving aside from that, I want to move past motivations pretty quickly. Let's talk about big evil at scale. This is kind of what we do. Take all those numbers, all the evil we want to look at. I think there's really 2 key trends about big evil at scale that we want to pass on. The first is you have to be able to frame it, distill it, and then prioritize it. It's a huge amount of the work that we do. So let's kind of take the dots. This is all the bad stuff in the world. Here's the good news is it's not infinite. The malicious activity, the bad guys, the threat, it is not infinite. It is not all-knowing. It's not a zillion of these things. You can actually count them. You can measure them. You can respond to them. So let's start with how big that box is. This was last year for us. This is kind of the big piece. We brought in and analyzed, let's say, 1.7 million discrete threat items. This is C2. This is a malicious file. This is a host used by an adversary. This could be any of those things. There wasn't a trillion of those. There was 1.7 million. It's got a real number. You can put your arms around it. We keep talking about the malicious files, 1.1 million a day. That boiled down into, we saw 754 malware families active last year. Of that number, about 60% were net new to last year. So we saw, let's make the math easy again, 450 malware families that had never been seen in the wild before show up at our clients. At about 300 old malware families that were still active. It's not a million, it's 754. You can get your arms around that.
Steve, how does that compare to FireEye's global number of malware families?
Say it again?
Global number of malware families. How many do we track? What percentage of that?
Oh, man. I'd be curious for any of our guys. If you find out I said the answer wrong, please correct me. But I think we're looking at 3,000 malware families all time forever for the globe. So let's say 3,000. Let's take 750. We're seeing about 25% of all malware families ever active in a given year. Of that 1 out of 4, 60% of those are net new for that year. So that's kind of the malware for all time, forever, according to Steve Stone. So there's that. Here's 2 things I want to talk about a lot. We spend a lot of time focused on these things, techniques and clusters. One thing I like about the MITRE ATT&CK framework is it kind of institutionalizes attackers can only do so many things. We internally at FireEye have had a similar nomenclature. We've got it internally, and we track about 1,300-ish techniques. There's only about 1,300 things a bad guy can do. It's not a million, it's not a trillion, it's 1,300. Of the different groups or clusters of activity we track, it's again not a million, it's about 1,600-ish. I think we just created our almost 1,700 cluster this week, I think we're at for numbers. We're just right close to it. Clusters can be anything. APT41 is a cluster. We can have a new piece of C2, a new TTP, and we have a technical anchor. That can be a cluster, and anything in between. We refer to them as UNCs. I'll mention them here in a little bit, but that cluster can be a wide range of actual, how big is that technical bucket. But we use these clusters because we want to hunt for these on the wire. It's one thing to read about a threat. It's another thing, can you now go after that in your environment? And we track, for all time, a little over 1,600 of those. So this is the big picture. Let's talk about the distillation, which is what our team does. How many of these things matter? They all don't matter. The machines do a lot of this work. A lot of this is already picked up. So let's talk about what's new and novel, what's really impactful, what's likely to be missed without expert analysis. And that number gets much smaller. It's about 8% of the total. So we talk about 1.7 million discrete threat items. We at FireEye hand-tasked 17,000 pieces of C2 we felt were operated by adversaries. This doesn't mean that there's not more out there, but these are the things that we said we have to focus on, these 17,000 pieces of C2. That's a great number. You can work with that number in this industry.
Steve, what does it mean to task a C2?
Yeah, great question. So it can be a domain, it can be an IP, and we load it across our services and sensors, and also we look for some of these things in the wild and say, where's this at? Do we see these at our clients? We've actually got, again, I'll plug another presentation coming up. We have ability to task and harvest evil C2 that we've seen before it's used at FireEye, and then when we see it, we're ready that first minute, that first hour.
So this is all attacker-controlled infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Tracking it, monitoring it.
100%. Yep. Of that 370 million malicious files, you don't need to reverse engineer most of that. We only reverse engineered about 1,400 files last year. That 1,400 files came down again to that 458 new malware families. So that's that whole, you go from 370 million, 1,400, 470. That's a workable number. You can deal with that in an incident response category. If we talk about these 1,300 techniques, most of these techniques, the boxes will do just fine for you. You don't need an expert to deal with 1,200-ish of these techniques. There's about 100 techniques that we at FireEye say, if we see these demonstrated anywhere, we're waking people up. We care about 103 of these techniques. That's what we're going to focus on. We're going to put our experts on that number. So it's about 7 to 8% of all things an attacker can do. Groups are the same way.
Can you give an example of like what some of the key evil techniques are and why?
Yeah, so some of it can be the C2 mechanism. It can be, is this technique designed to be destructive? If it's destructive, we care. We're always going to care for anything destructive. It could be anything in that spectrum. The groups are the same way. We've got these 1,600 and growing clusters. There's about 100 groups that we as a company say, we are going to focus our top experts on these groups and not worry about the rest of the clusters. That's a pretty manageable number again. You can hunt for 100 groups. You cannot hunt for 1,600 groups. It's not real. It's not possible. Inside that 107, we named FIN and APT groups publicly. We saw half of our FIN groups active last year and a little less than half of all of our known APT groups active as well. So that 100-ish groups that we really care about 1 out of 5 is a named APT or FIN group that we talk about publicly. So this is lesson 1. It's manageable. It's got boundaries. You can distill it, and now you can get after the real threat. You don't need your experts focused on the internet. The internet's fine. The machines can handle the internet. Let's focus on the 107 groups, the 103 techniques, and now we're cooking with gas. The second lesson is you've got to be able to do technical attribution every single day in perpetuity. You have to be able to do this over time, every day, all day. So let's start with APT41. We've got a great APT41 presentation coming up. Ray, Dan, I'll hype those guys up. I won't talk about APT41 at all, even though I really want to. I really love APT41. Let's talk about how we made APT41. It didn't just show up. We've been tracking this group, this activity for years. So APT41 was first born years ago as UNC78. Uncategorized group 78. If we're at uncategorized group 1,700 today, that gives you perspective for how long we've dealt with this group. And that's the way it works, right? You got UNC78, and then you call them APT41, and it's awesome, right? That'd be awesome. But it doesn't work that way. That's not how technical attribution works. So for example, what we did was UNC78 didn't become APT41. We actually combined UNC78 with 9 other groups we learned and tracked over time. APT41 is actually the conglomeration of 10 distinct entities that we tracked and provided tradecraft against over a course of years. In addition, we also looked at 6 other groups we thought might be related. We had overlap. Another vendor said it was the same thing. We looked at our technical data, our organic data, and we said we cannot make that work. So we actually examined 16 different groups to make APT 41. 10 made the cut, 6 did not. And if that's not enough, we did the exact same thing with malware. We actually, over a period of years, thought we had net new malware, learned a year later, 2 years later, it's actually the same files. And we have to merge those malware families together. This is hard work. This is understanding your data and your analysis day in and day out. So let's give some perspective for how big that is for us. We've tracked this group for 8 years. We didn't get to make APT 41 in 2019. It started in 2011. You have to deal with all of your mistakes that you made from 2011 to today. If you want to be humbled, it's really awesome when you're now in charge of these kind of efforts and somebody's like, hey, boss, I see this moron made some attribution mistakes in 2013. His name is Steve Stone. It's like super embarrassing. But if you're not tracking your analysis, if you can't correct it and fix it, you can't effectively do things like APT 41. You can't effectively hunt for these groups where they live in our clients.
Steve.
Yes, sir.
Quick question. Some of those groups, those were the clusters you were talking about.
Yes.
What did those represent before they all came into what became APT 41?
Yeah, so before we would merge them together, we actually treated them as distinct entities. Let's say we had an IR and we say, we see this IOC correlate with UNC78. We see this other IOC, which might be related, correlate with fill in an UNC number. And we just treated them as distinct entities because we didn't know, were these 2 different attackers in the same place at the same time? Is it the same group that's evolved 6 months later? So we keep them separate and distinct until we can actually provide technical overlap, which we require our analysts to do. We require that analyst boss to vet. We require somebody else qualified to verify it, and then a 4th person to actually merge it together. So we take this business incredibly serious here at FireEye. We mentioned the 7 malware family merges. APT41's got 45 malware families. Like, this thing is massive. We've got 57 finished intelligence reports that are still available. Our clients get to score us where we write 3 years ago, where we write 4 years ago. And oh, by the way, just because we call it one thing doesn't mean that everybody else does either. This group is known by 8 different industry AKAs. Some of those we agree with, some of those we do not. You can't make that understanding and delineation if you haven't been doing technical attribution every single day. You don't get to decide all of a sudden you want to do this and then start looking through the data. You have to do this day in and day out. So this is the second piece of Big Evil at scale. Technical attribution every single day, forever. The next trend I want to talk about is let's get into dual use a little bit. This was a thing, I actually gave a presentation at one of the very first MIRCons on like, what happens if the super advanced groups quit using custom malware and use red teaming tools? Wouldn't that be crazy? It's crazy. That totally happened. Happens all the time. So let's just talk about Beacon. Beacon's the implant side of Cobalt Strike. We see it every single day here at FireEye. We've looked at about 5,000 samples of Beacon. About a third of these we assess are valid. They're legitimate, they're licensed, they're used for legitimate purposes. Some of these are pen tests and red teams. Some of these are clients. So about 1 out of 3 of these Beacon samples, we're able to say, we know what that is. Let's UNC it so we can track it and assess it. Some of this is our red team. Some of this is another vendor's red team. Some of this is a client security shop. Great. Put it in a bucket so when we see it, we quit chasing it. That leaves about 3,500 other Beacon samples that we do not know if they're legitimate or licensed. Right off the bat, this is a problem. How do you assess 2 out of 3 things you don't know are legitimate? Of that 3,400, we have assessed about 700 in the last year are evil. An active malicious group is using these for malicious reasons, not a red team, an actual intrusion group. Of that 708, we've seen 200 used against our clients. What's really interesting on that number is, if you just kind of look at some of these groups here, some of this makes sense, right? Like APT32, I love them, they're an APT group, but like they're not super advanced. They're just not. They do some neat things, they're not APT41. So it makes sense that APT32 is using Cobalt Strike. But so is APT41. You know who doesn't need Cobalt Strike? APT41. These guys can build tools at will. They can do, I won't steal the APT41's thunder, but these guys know their business. They're really, really good, and they're choosing to use these tools that are legitimate tools that you can go buy or you can use and we're seeing other places. So just the APT side alone, we saw 4 different APT groups use Beacon against our clients. This is just one sample. We could literally, you name a pen test red team tool, you name a public framework, and we'll show you malicious activity. This is not unique to Beacon at all. This is with all of the tools.
Hey, Steve, random question. The question is,
red teams are all in the blue number. So all red teams we assess are good guys because they're trying to help us. Yeah, everything in the red number is an actual criminal or nation-state program of trying to do malicious activity in our clients.
Hey, how do we know the difference between licensed and unlicensed samples?
So I'm going to punt that one to Aaron Stevens. He's going to talk about that a little bit in his. But long story short is we're able to assess the versions. We're able to assess the licenses. There's some other things we can do tradecraft-wise to kind of understand that build, that use, that execution.
And do we have instances of licensed samples to known APT groups?
I would take a mulligan on that one. I don't think we do, but I'll double check on that one. Off the top of my head, I'm actually not sure of that one. If anybody else in the audience, if one of our guys wants to double check on that, we'll come back to that in the questions, but we'll table that one. Yes, I heard a yes from one of our guys. This is the last key trend I'll give you guys. You heard our boss mention it. He mentioned trust. I actually went to pull some numbers together, and they're like just so bad. They're all 100%. So I actually didn't put any numbers for this slide at all. Your trust will be exploited. This is the go-to power move for any group that knows what they're doing. I cannot put into words how often we see this. We see this like basically everywhere. This has been a really interesting trend for me personally. The very first threat brief I ever gave was when I was in the DoD a lifetime ago, and we had to convince the US government, like, yeah, like you actually have nation states hacking your computers. Oh, BT dubs, they're not hacking, they're logging in. This has been going on that long. There is no malware you can build that is as powerful as valid access. The networks, the environments, the hosts exist to do valid things. If you can become a valid user, you have the power of that organization at your disposal. I just kind of list 4 general buckets. The biggest thing I would say on this, everybody tends to think about trust exploitation as either this, your compromised creds, or an insider. It's so much more varied than that. We see compromised creds used by all kinds of threat groups across the entire spectrum of capability. And on the high end, we have some threat groups that can also subvert multi-factor authentication. Can all groups do it? Definitely not. Can some do it? Definitely can. The insiders, we talked about this. This happens about 1.5% of the times. Statistically, this is not where your valid access threat is. These middle parts
Steve,
are really difficult for us. Yes, sir.
On the insiders, can you speak to those investigations and how they're different from the rest of them? So like, are the 2% of cases easier or harder because they're insiders?
Yeah, so good question. I'm going to generalize a little bit with those 12 confirmed insider events we have, and I'll say a couple of things. One is, insider events tend to be better for us to respond to because you can bring more of an organization to bear. If you're dealing purely with on-network, your HR department probably can't help you. But if you have an insider, you now have people that can be brought to bear from the client, which really help us out. You can actually say, like, who used to sit in that desk? Somebody find a name. Your IT guy is not going to tell you that. There's another resource you didn't have for phishing. So by and large, you've got some more resources to work with there. The other part is, and I'm going to grossly generalize, but a lot of these insider events are actually not that impactful. If we had to list out the 100 biggest, most concerning breaches from last year, none of these insiders are going to be on there. They're typically lower level. They're typically extortion. There's potential there. I don't want to sit and say insiders shouldn't be a thing that we think about, but we've got to be realistic about it. We just don't have a lot of really big, impactful insiders tied to intrusions. That's just kind of the numbers. As I'm sure as soon as I'm saying that, it's happening right now, and I'll be made a fool tomorrow. But that's just where the kind of hard numbers lead us. The hard numbers lead us to these. There is nothing more difficult in an intrusion than finding a valid user that was created valid from day one. Compromised creds, that can be difficult. When those compromised creds are used to create a brand new account, which has only ever been valid, that's hard. That's complicated intrusion work right there. You need a lot of assets to get after that really effectively. And then trusted partners. Again, I'll ping the APT41 talk. We're talking about supply chain compromise. That was a hypothetical. It's not a hypothetical anymore. It's happened. It's happened to our clients. Trusted partners. These groups understand how we work. We're not on the first year of this industry. We're going into the second or third decade, depending on what you want to measure from. They understand we use GitHub. So guess what? They know that GitHub is going to be open for most of our networks. So they build C2 in GitHub. They understand that we use Google for functionality. So guess what? They build C2 in Google. This is not rocket science. They're going where we go, and they're exploiting that relationship however they can. So when you think about trust, you've got to think about all of these things. And if I ever get asked, like, tell me what I want to be concerned about, this is it. Malware families are one thing, C2 is another thing. Trust is hard, and trust is dangerous, and trust is common. Those things kind of lead to really a big focus effort for us. So with that all being said, that's kind of the trends that we see. I'll kind of leave you with 3 recommendations. We get asked, what can a client do? What can another vendor do? What can a government do? And these are going to sound overly simplistic, but I'm a big fan of the fundamentals. I think the fundamentals absolutely matter. The first one is you've got to plan for partnerships. Nobody is in this alone. And I'm notorious for talking about partnerships that I don't think are effective or that there's this thing that's not going to be worthwhile, but they are. Partnerships will help you. We as FireEye do not secure our own environment by ourselves. We have partners. We have lots of partners. You've got to find a partner you trust, a partner you can depend on, and then frankly, the biggest mistake I see with partnerships is people partner with people, people partner with people just like them. That's a terrible mistake, absolutely terrible. Find somebody that doesn't do what you do. I'll tell you what we're awful at. We are awful at understanding a given user in an environment. It's not my job. I don't know what your user does. I actually don't care. I know about bad guys. So don't hire us because you think we understand your user base. We do not. That's your job as a client. Find partners that provide capabilities that correlate versus augment. Find things that you can map and pivot across to. The second thing, and we kind of mentioned this a couple different times, you've got to be prepared for remediations, plural. It's very rare that we do a remediation event and it works the first time. That you talk to any of the Mandiant, the managed defense guys, it almost never works that way. You do remediation, you see what got through, you do it again. You see what got through. You do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And that's when you get through the event. And then you get prepared to do it again 6 months down the road or a year down the road. This isn't just about event response either. This is about, is your legal office ready to make a public disclosure statement? I've been in this business long enough to be proven wrong a lot. One of the things I've been wrong about was, if you'd have asked me years ago, are clients going to discuss breaches publicly? I would have said absolutely not. Dumbest thing I've ever heard. Never going to happen. And we track our clients going public. We've seen 2 this week alone, and it's Wednesday. It's just the way of the world now. So you've got to be prepared for your entire organization to deal with reattacks and remediation. And the last thing, we get asked, every single one of these clients we work with, tell me what I should buy. Give me a vendor, give me a product. This isn't the old days where there was like one dominant product. There's great product out there. I'm partial to ours, but there's a lot of good other vendors too. There's a lot of great companies and organizations that you can work with. So what I recommend is pay for 2 things. First, pay for a pivot. If you have good network capability, don't buy perfect network capability. Get some endpoint. If you have endpoint, get some cloud visibility. Figure it out. Figure out how you can pivot and move with an attacker as they move through your environment. There's nothing more valuable than paying for that pivot, except for maybe institutional memory. I cannot tell you how many events were dead in the water on day 1 because that memory does not exist. I mean 2 things by memory. The first is actual like data storage, like memory, like we talk about on devices. Go back to that 78 days. Imagine we show up on day 1, the attacker's been there for 78 days, and the logs rewrote every 3 days. We're done. We will never find the initial intrusion vector. It got wiped 25 times ago. Institutional memory at the data level is cheap, it's incredibly powerful, and it allows you to understand the totality of the event. The other part of memory we recommend paying for is this remediation and reattacks. Organizations respond to breaches with not just their IT staffs anymore. You go back to that 18 months. 2 out of 3 events we see same or similar back within 18 months. That is 6 quarters in the corporate world. That's an actual lifetime. Anybody would know how long the average CISO stays in office? 13 months. 13 months. So the statistics bear out that your CISO will probably come and go by the time that breach that you dealt with comes back. And now you have to relearn that. So hopefully you can pay and invest in institutional memory, understand, does your legal team remember? Does your CEO remember? What worked? What didn't? Oh, and by the way, please, please, please buy data storage. Like, for real, buy data storage. It's amazing. So these are 3 recommendations that we'll leave all of you guys with. With that, I think we've got an additional 5 minutes for questions if we want to kind of see what's out there. I actually can't see at all with the lights, so no questions from anybody?
Steve's entire team is here and can do attribution on anything you want, by the way.
Yes, sir. It is. Yes, we assess as Chinese nation state. Then somebody messed up the graphic. I can tell you APT41 is not DPRK. I have not seen that graphic, but I can tell you definitively APT41 is not DPRK. I'll definitely let somebody know. I appreciate that. We were able to roll them into one of the two. I'm sorry, let me readdress the question. I apologize. Sorry, you can ask it again at the microphone.
Yeah. So the question from Tim Malcolm-Better was, he'd like to know about the 2,000 unlicensed Cobalt Strike beacon samples that fell on the floor. Are they uncategorized groups, adversary, emulation? You don't know yet.
Can we go back to that slide, please? I apologize. It's the one with the red and the blue breakouts. There is a small delta, so we got 49, so we got, let's see, 3,400 plus 1,400, so we're at 48. The number bears out.
We attributed a bunch to known evil, so there's like a bunch of
Gotcha.
unlicensed samples.
So the 3,400 to the 708.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just, we couldn't give a definitive assessment. It just kind of boils down to, we tracked them, we either didn't see them again, or we couldn't attribute them to one of those known threat clusters. So as a company, we don't call anything bad unless we can prove it. Unless we can pull data out and show you it was bad, we're not going to assess it as such, which is why that number is what it is. Okay, guys, I think we're at time. Oh, sorry, one more.
Microphone's right there if you want to just stand up.
Sorry, but could you emphasize more on a Cobalt Strike, and what are some more advanced attacks that you see with the APT41?
Okay, so sorry, I didn't catch all of it. You want to talk about Cobalt Strike and APT41 advanced attacks. I'm not going to say anything about APT41 only because we've got a whole APT41 presentation coming up. I'll tease it a little bit. Aside from maybe APT1, which was obviously a big deal for Mandiant because of the geopolitical ramifications, I'm not sure there's a more impactful group that we've seen at FireEye than APT41. As an actual threat group, take everything else aside, you've got a group that is supporting a nation-state program. We know they're hacking on their own for profit. That's fascinating. They can roll out tools almost at will. We see their tools propagate across larger Chinese ecosystems but originate with them. That's fascinating. We see supply chain, I mean, you name it. They're kind of like the whole package. And there's so much volume. We've got active APT41 events as I'm on the stage. We typically, if we do a big public release, we tend to see adversaries shift a little bit. APT41, nope, they're on it. They're on the grind. They're on that rise and grind. So they went and they read our blog. They downloaded the paper. They looked at it, and they went right back to work. I love APT41. They're a really genuine, legitimate adversary. The Cobalt Strike question, what I would say is, and we just picked that as an example. There is nothing unique to Cobalt Strike there. I mean, you pick a framework, and those numbers will be if anything, the Cobalt Strike numbers are probably a little bit lower because of how that framework is rolled out. Part of the reason we're able to attribute some of the good stuff is because of how that framework is licensed. There's other tools that are far nastier than that. That's nothing to do with Cobalt Strike. That's got to do with bad guys pick up frameworks that work, and they go to town. Some of those guys have to because they can't build their own. Some of those guys choose to no matter what, and they're off and running.
Just to chime in, Steve, and I think we place a lot of emphasis on attribution because if something like Cobalt Strike or Meterpreter is used in your environment, if you can't tell the difference between a red team and a bona fide, unauthorized adversary, you're going to have a really tough time responding.
Yep. And we've seen those things in the exact same environment at the exact same time. You want to talk about a hard incident response? Deal with a valid pen tester using Beacon at the exact same time APT41 is using Beacon. That's a long day. You're in for a really tough day teasing that out when it's the same environment, and it happens. Okay, great. I think we're at time. I appreciate everyone's time. I'll stick around. I can answer your question. I see the hand. So thank you, everyone.